everybody, and welcome back to the Responsible AI Report from the Responsible AI Institute, where we are speaking with some of the leading voices in responsible AI. I'm very excited. We have Vilas Dhar joining us today. Vilas, thanks so much for being with us.
Patrick, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for the invite.
I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to chat today. You are, of course, the president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And I know for myself personally, it's been very inspiring to see the work that you are doing at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, just with regards to initiatives and programs around AI for humanity, as well as the wide variety of different organizations that you fund to carry out this work. There is a lot of uncertainty happening right now in the world of AI, as I'm sure you're well aware. Google recently removed its pledge to not use AI for weapons from their website. Of course, the head of the AI Safety Institute, Elizabeth Kelly, recently left her position. And then Elon Musk's Doge is developing an AI chatbot to modernize the U.S. government, which, of course, there are a variety of different concerns around that. So given all of this information and just where things are headed in the AI landscape, what role do you believe philanthropy can play in ensuring equitable and responsible AI development amid rapid technological shifts?
Well, Patrick, that's a big question. I'm eager to dig into it with you. I think a couple of framing thoughts. You framed it very nicely for us. There is a lot of change happening, but what I'm deeply concerned about and worried about is those things that we've been calling for, that you've been calling for, that so many have, which are basic values and normative principles about how we build not our AI tools, but what our society looks like when it's enabled by AI, are at deep risk. They're at risk for a number of reasons, and we could talk about the political frames, but I'm actually more interested for today's conversation to talk about the economic frames. The idea that for so many companies that started out by really setting responsible and ethical use of these tools as a key priority, market forces, the potential for vast sums of profit, moving away from some of those core principles of design, have led to a marketplace where you're seeing the kind of announcements that you just spoke about. We're deeply concerned about this. And the answer to that is not necessarily what can philanthropy do. I am an unlikely philanthropist in many ways. And I think for me, the answer is very rarely that philanthropy can do something. But rather, I put my trust and hope and optimism in the voices of people and communities around the world. People that some would say we should consider them as consumers, and that's often how they're typified in a tech discourse. But to me, to reduce the interests of a community down to a consumer is to fundamentally violate our basic principles of dignity. It strikes me that if we are really talking about decisions and technology that affect all of us, that every person on the planet should be more than just a participant. We should be shared architects of what that digital future looks like. So if that's the core thesis, then I think the question becomes, well, what do our institutions do to really support the enablement of better decision making? Where does civil society play a role in supporting communities to say, look, we know that you have both proximity to challenges. How do we make sure you have the same proximity to technological solutions? How do we make sure that as you understand how these tools are used at scale, you're building not just tech capacity, but a socio-technical understanding of what these tools mean and an ability to express your viewpoints on what that future should look like? I know this is a long answer. I appreciate you indulging me, but it's so important that we get this right. It's not about what we should be doing. It's about fundamentally reframing a question that we've lost sight of. Who's responsible for building a responsible tech future? To me, it's never going to be technologists. And as tempting as it sounds, it's not going to be technologists and policymakers either. It's going to have to be a participatory and inclusive process. And what we need to do is make sure that we're enabling that.
Yeah, Vilas, you really hit the nail on the head just with regards to it being a civil society issue in a lot of ways. Technology impacts everybody's lives. It's exactly as you were saying. How are we phrasing that question in how we approach AI and responsible AI? I would love to hear your thoughts on ethical AI frameworks. On the global governance front, how can we reinforce international collaboration to ensure equitable, inclusive, and transparent AI systems, and that they remain a priority through all of this shifting?
Yeah, it's a great question, Patrick. And as you alluded to, the ground often feels like it's shifting beneath our feet on very short timeframes with especially recent political developments. But let me give you a longitudinal answer. Over the last year and a half, I was appointed by the UN Secretary General to the high-level advisory body on AI. And the mandate the SG gave us was essentially to say what needs to happen in order to ensure that across risks and across opportunities, we actually build a mechanism for global governance at scale. As a group, we conducted hundreds and even thousands of engagements and interviews with communities and experts across the country and across the world, and came to a conclusion that we couldn't really have great governance without fundamentally changing the mechanism of capacity. If we continue to say that a few of the developed countries will hold almost all of the compute, a significant amount of the talent, and most of the world's data, then how can we honestly and fairly say there's a transparent mechanism here for global governance? We can't quite get there. So I think that's the starting point of the frame, is to recognize the reality that governance doesn't happen with shared capacity, and shared capacity doesn't happen without public investment. One of the things that we've really dug into in the United States and much of the global north is the idea that the private sector will be our technological wizards, right? And I come from the private sector, I've built companies in this space. The model that the private markets will build our technological future for us is so entrenched. But if you leave the global north and you go to countries where there's a significant amount of talent and drive, but sometimes just a total paucity of capital, you find that that innovation engine just doesn't start in the same way. So how do we fix this? Well, I think we need to fix it with public capital, with governments investing in meaningful tech capacity. And as you might have seen just very recently, we supported, as a part of the Paris AI Action Summit, the launch of something called Current AI that promises hundreds of millions of dollars of funding and support, primarily from philanthropies and governments, to build capacity at scale for AI. So
Wow.
that's the starting point, right? I mean, that's where we have to begin is if people don't have the tools, how can we ask them to govern them?
Yeah, yeah. And I have another question kind of to go off of that. How much do you think education plays into this as well? Because I hear a lot of criticism sometimes that a big reason why regulation moves so slow is because policymakers, regulators are still trying to figure out how this technology works. So, where does education play a role in that as well?
Yeah, education's a funny word. We often think of it in very formal ways, but I think of education as exactly the kind of curiosity that you and I express, the ways we go out and engage with these tools to learn about them, and then, of course, the formal elements of an educational system as well. We've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years working with policymakers to ensure that they have access to the kinds of experts, but also the hands-on tooling so they can actually begin to understand what these tools represent. I think that's a really important thing. But let's zoom out on the question. What are we asking our policymakers to do? This, I think, is the fundamental construct of the problem, is too often policymakers they see their roles as responding to and regulating tech companies. And we see that debate play out in the public sphere all the time, right? One of our big tech companies does something that feels a little bit icky. And we see a regulator come in and say, I'm going to try to pass some legislation to limit it. And I think that's an important role, but it also feels deeply limiting of a more foundational vision of what representative democracy is supposed to be. My question is this: if all governments think they need to do is limit the actions of big tech, then where's the work happening that actually creates new and inspiring visions of what a technological future that works for all of us is? Where does that come from? I think that's the trick of education, is whether it's with our policymakers or with our broad-based citizenry, my brothers and sisters and yours, how do we ensure that people have a focus and an idea that technology isn't merely something to be regulated, it's something to be directed in ways that actually further our common welfare. And in order to do that, how do we make sure that everyone has the broad-based digital literacy to be able to envision what those futures should look like?
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Just that reframing. It's so simple and yet so complex at the same time. And the approach, I think, is very encouraging just with regards to, okay, we just need to make sure that we're asking the right questions. As AI becomes increasingly embedded in the public infrastructure and decision making, I would love to hear your thoughts, Vilas. How do we ensure its development remains accountable, transparent, and aligned with the public interest? I think you were just touching upon this a bit as well with education, but I would love to go a little bit deeper on that.
Yeah. I think we've tried a few approaches and we've seen that none of them by themselves work particularly well. We saw voluntary commitments from a number of tech companies, but we also saw the immense decentralization of AI capacity. We saw that it used to take the most massive supercompute talent data in order to build these foundation models. And just in the last few weeks, we saw alternate cases coming forward of potentially models that were trained on significantly fewer resources. So what we see is a proliferation of these models. Voluntary self-commitments aren't going to cut it. Then we saw an attempt by government to say we want to limit market access based on safety. The idea that the safety institutes would establish thresholds and companies would have to go to them. But unfortunately, we're seeing that that mechanism is also not potentially going to last for very long. We're seeing political shifts in how those were created. So it comes back to me to a fundamental question of power. Who has the power to ensure that the companies that are building these tools act responsibly? To me, there's always a dual answer there. On one side, you have the traditional answer of regulators or policymakers. But second, and I think maybe even more powerful, is the actions of everyday citizens who are buying these products, using these products, managed to maintain both political activism and civil society power to go and advocate for our interests in privacy, in dignity, in making sure that these tools aren't used in ways that harm us. We're not quite there yet, though, Patrick. I think people are quite curious about these questions. They're seeing this emerging chasm in the power gulf between those who are building and deploying the tools and those who are being preyed upon. But we haven't yet gotten to the point of broad-based public movements. And I do think we're going to see that. I think that is the absolutely necessary response over the next decade or so.
Yeah, we'll certainly see how things evolve over time. The space is continuously changing, and Vilas, we're very fortunate to have leaders like yourself who are educating us and the public on what we need to know as AI continues to advance and how we go about implementing this responsibly as well. Vilas, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join us for the Responsible AI Report, and not only for taking the time, but also just your commitment to this work as well. Even just through this conversation, it's allowed me the opportunity to reframe how I'm looking at these very essential questions and how we go about developing and deploying AI. So I'm so glad that you were able to join us. Before we part ways, I'm wondering if you could just share more information about where our listeners could find out more about you, your work, as well as the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation.
Well, Patrick, you're very kind to say that. I will tell you, I'm such a fan of the work that you all do at the Responsible AI Institute. And we need entities and institutions just like yours to continue to build a public awareness and engagement. I learn a lot from you all, and I thank you for doing the work you do. For any viewers that want to engage, I hope they will connect with us. LinkedIn is a great place. I post pretty regularly on the policy frameworks, as does the foundation and across other social media. But what I'll leave you with is one final thought. If we are designing a future that, in my greatest optimism, is going to have digital tools and technologies that allow us to be inspired, creative, wonderful human beings, then I think we should also feel a shared sense of moral responsibility now to make sure that those are the futures we create. It means the power is in our hands.
Yeah, absolutely. A great way to end this episode. Vilas, thank you so much again.
Thank you.